On today's show, Nikolaj Ehlers is headed to the Cap. Hurricanes? Hurricanes?
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the past 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minute Cast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, Nikolaj Ehlers is headed to the Hurricanes. The agony of defeat. I felt like the Capitals were this close. As it turns around, Nikolaj Ehlers is a Cane. We'll talk about that a bit later. We'll talk about Cole Hutson's breakout. One player that is really lighting it up at Capitals development camp is Cole Hutson, a truly great defender and is going to change the outlook of the Capitals blue line in the future. I'll talk about that a bit later. I'll talk about Milton Gästrin signs his entry-level contract, if his name sounds familiar, from this most recent draft here. A bit later, we'll talk about Lynden Lakovic's first taste of the NHL life. Listen, this guy's loving it, exuberant, a true character, a great player, part of the next wave of the Capitals. I'll talk about the latest with him at Capitals development camp. But the big story, the agony of defeat, is that Ehlers says no and Beauvillier says yes. Is that what we were hoping for? A consolation prize? I feel like we're on a game show. And is it Ehlers? Nope, but we've got some lovely parting gifts for you. You won a Anthony Beauvillier. Yeah, we re-signed a guy that was already on the team, and the Canes got a bright new shiny toy. And at the end of the day, we have nothing to do but be okay about it and hope that to a certain extent that maybe a bigger move is coming. But I got a kind of a hunch that there isn't a bigger move coming. And I'm already hearing it on social media, and I kind of believe it a little bit, the pessimistic, cynical, just anger that's in me, that I have a feeling that Brian McClellan would have got Nikolaj Ehlers done somehow. He would have figured it out. And I'm not trying to challenge Chris Patrick's general managing prowess, but it just seems like that was the one you should have got. That was the one you should have got. That was the one where you could have stamped Chris Patrick's name, stamp right on the Capitals organization, and swing and a miss. That's kind of how I feel. I don't want to feel that way, but I do feel that way. And then once the anger subsides and, reality comes back to my angered mind, I realize maybe it's for the best. Nikolaj Ehlers, they would have well overpaid for him. And if you look into him, he is a bit injury prone. And at the end of the day, would he have stood in the way of Capitals prospects on their way up? So it's one of the ways, in my mind, is that way of just kind of sanding the sharp edges off and saying, yeah, maybe it's okay. But you take a look at Anthony Beauvillier, and I started off by saying he's a consolation prize. I say that with hyperbole. Is he Nikolaj Ehlers quality? No, he's not. As much as I want to shine this, I can't do it. He's a good bottom six player. At points, he can contribute and play on the first line with Alex Ovechkin. But at the end of the day, you've got to know that he wasn't the pick of the litter. And somewhere, Anthony Beauvillier has to feel like, if you're a guy and maybe there was a girl you were interested in for a long time and you asked out a different girl instead, and she says no, you go back to the original girl and say, hey, you if you want to go on a date, they know they're the consolation prize. Anthony Beauvillier knows he's the consolation prize. And if you take a look at the analytics, let's dive into that. I'm going into the deep weeds here before I even dig into the meat and potatoes. Let's dive into that. The latest with the Capitals and their swing and a miss on Nikolaj Ehlers, in my opinion. So, you take a look at it. The Capitals were in on Nikolaj Ehlers. I think that Chris Patrick made a pitch, gave it a few days, and then boom, he signs with Carolina. 6-year deal. And not going to lie, this one stung a little bit too much. And I think there's probably a little bit of Chris Patrick that's like, I'm going to do it. Who's available? Who's a big name target that I could search out and acquire? I'm going to do it. Get me his number right now. That you got to think to a certain extent that his ability to pull off a big deal and not being able to pull it off has to be a bit challenging. You got to think that. That's how I'm wired anyway. I'm a very competitive person in certain levels in my life, but it's not a total shock, but it definitely left the Capitals scrambling a bit. And, like I said, the timing was interesting, shall we say, that, it broke, later-ish in the afternoon, mid-afternoon, that Nikolaj Ehlers was going to the Hurricanes, and you knew there was rumblings out there that there's going to have to be an answer here because, you're looking for a dance partner and, there's not a lot of dance partners left out there. And hey, Anthony Beauvillier, you want to dance? I'm Chris Patrick. That's what happened. And you take a look at it, it's tough. I mean, they were banking on that one, and a good reason. Ehlers would have been, an instant top 6 winger, play driver, fast, creative, exactly what this group needed. I had him penciled in my mind. That's what's always so hard is you start to visualize things, and then all of a sudden they're taken away from you. That's what burns a lot. So what did Chris Patrick do? He circled back to the guy they know pretty well, Anthony Beauvillier. And yeah, he was a sneaky good fit down the stretch last year, right? Yeah, I mean, all things considered, you saw him play on the first line with Alex Ovechkin and Dylan Strome. And, we can take the Wayback Machine or, look into his past, I guess you could say, and say, hey, he even played with Sidney Crosby. The guy's got some upside. But here's the thing and why it's a little bit more palatable if you want to take a look at it. If you're looking for a silver lining in this not so great story is they signed him Thursday night to a 2-year, $5.5 million contract. That is a $2.75 million per year. Far cry from what Nikolaj Ehlers made. Decent raise from his old 1.25, but honestly, still a bargain for what he brings. A little top 6 potential, bottom 6 utility, but super versatile. And that's what Spencer Carbery said, that he is a guy, a bit of a Swiss Army knife, if you will, that you can plug and play. So there is some value to that. I'm not trying to diminish it, but Beauvillier, he played all over, top line with Ovi at times, like I said, fourth line with Dowd. And yeah, he was solid. And I was skeptical. Well, when the Capitals traded for him, the only move on the trade deadline, Anthony Beauvillier, yeah, I've heard of the name, but I haven't really heard it spoke of glowingly in a while. But in his 18 games post-deadline with the Caps, just 2 goals and 3 assists, not eye-popping, right? But in the playoffs, he steps up 6 points in 10 games. So stepping up when you're needed, played with pace, played with purpose. The thing I like about Anthony Beauvillier is he understands the assignment, that this is the postseason and the messing around time is over. And Coach Carbery, he was all in, called him fearless, talked about his forechecking, his puck pursuit, edge work, using his feet well, even though he's a smaller guy. So, yeah, the Ehlers whiff hurts, but bringing Beauvillier back, that's a solid plan. B, I guess you could say. And, it is tough, as you see the teams around the NHL get that much better, because guess what? Vegas is going to be that much more harder to play against. Guess what? The Hurricanes are going to be that much harder to play against. The Islanders, the Panthers. There are teams that got exponentially better just in the last week or so. And what did the Capitals do? Well, all of their UFAs, except for Anthony Beauvillier, is gone. So, Taylor Radish, Andrew Mangiapane, Alexiev, All these guys, Gonzo, and what have you added? You added some players in Hershey, and you added, a couple depth pieces, if you will. I'm talking about Declan Chisholm, and I'm talking, sort of these kind of guys, not the kind of names that go, yes, this team is serious about winning in 25-26. Look out, NHL. I did a podcast earlier. It's a fantasy hockey podcast. I'll post the link on YouTube. And they said, do you think the Capitals took a step forward, or will they take a step forward this year? Or do you think they'll take a step back? And I had to pause and I had to think about it, because going into all this, I thought a step forward. I had to think, surely there's something that's going to happen. And to be clear here, they still could. This isn't the trade deadline where you have a hard date to make a move and that's it. This was just to kick it off. But to be clear here, a lot of the bigger pieces have been claimed. Are there bigger pieces out there? Absolutely. Are the Capitals going to acquire them? I don't know. I think the Capitals right now are more fully vested in their future, which I don't hate. Because you take a look, was there the possibility in all of this, around this time frame, that the Capitals could have traded, a big name piece to get a bigger, older player? For sure. But I think the Capitals have done that for years and years and years, and they don't want to do it again. It's a two-sided coin. Do I wish they would have got an Ehlers? Yes. Just off the top, there's a lot of other players as well. But am I happy that it appears that the youth is going to get an opportunity? Yes to that as well. So not a total loss for the Capitals, but I'm not gonna lie here. This one stings just a little bit. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about Lynden Lakovic's first taste of the NHL life and how he is performing at the development camp. I'll discuss straight ahead. We've all been there before, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music events should be about making memories, not dealing with stress of ticket shopping. That's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever before. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with killer last-minute deals. Tired of endless scrolling trying to find the best deal? Game Time's Zone Deals pick the best seats in your section for you. Ever wonder what the view will actually look like before you buy? Guess what? The app uses panoramic seat views, so there are no surprises. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets for concerts and show tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me over on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in segment 2, we're talking Lynden Lakovic, the first round pick that the Capitals acquired, and pretty good upside. He is still a ways out. I'd say a couple to a few years out, but he is going to be a great piece for the Capitals in the future. So what's the latest with Lynden at the Capitals development camp? And, for a guy picked 27th overall, the one thing I'm going to say about him is this kid is fired up. It's that youthful exuberance, and you can see it, hear it, and feel it. And when you just watch the videos, you can tell that he is excited to be a part of the Capitals organization, and that's infectious. The moment that the Capitals called his name, he's on a plane, never been to DC before, and now he's in the thick of development camp, just soaking it all in. And as a guy that's played hockey his whole life, he has to absolutely love it. And he comes from what appears, like a hockey hotbed. Moose Jaw in the WHL, wore the C, captain, put up good numbers, 58 points in 47 games, physical, smart, heavy game. But now he's learning just how quick the NHL is. That's the hard part. When we talked about Leonard, when we talk about Crystal, and you think it's going to be a seamless transition from college or juniors to the NHL, not the case. Maybe for the most elite players out there, but by and large, it is jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. So when you take a look at Crystal, he might not necessarily, shoot to the moon in the fall. And Ryan Leonard might be a slow build, but that's why these guys are working on it. And if you take a look at Lynden Lakovic, he is still even a bit more undercooked now, shall we say. But he's had a great opportunity to work with a power skating coach, Wendy Marco. And, that's really helped. That was one of the knocks on Crystal's game as well, is that straight line speed and his skating. He needed to work on it. He needed to bulk up. So these power skating coaches, something that maybe you didn't see as much years ago, they really want to develop these players into NHL talent. A novel thought. It is an NHL development camp. So he's been picking up things quick, and he's been hanging out with who? Andrew Crystal. And Crystal has now kind of taken on a mentor role. I don't know, man. Time flies is what I'm saying. A mentor role, as this is his third development camp. And that's a cool thing to see, that Crystal was in this exact spot 2 years ago. So kind of crazy how quickly the time flies. Now, Lakovic said something interesting, too, that he wants to round out his 200-foot game, which you hear. That's something that Miro needed to work on. Use his frame more. Be better defensively. He's a big dude. Not, intrinsically a fighter, I guess I was going to say. He might grow into that. That's what's going to keep him in the NHL, that self-awareness that these guys have. You got to love that in an 18-year-old. And that's one of the things that Ross Mahoney said that really blows him away. And I've spoke about that on the show, if you're an everydayer, is that these younger guys are far more mature than in the old days. They're honest assessors of oneself. Ross Mahoney said that they'll ask these guys at the combine, where do you see yourself a year or two from now? And a lot of them are like, I got to work on my game. Maybe I'm going to have to put in a couple years in college or a couple years in junior to kind of get where I'm at. And he was saying that years ago, sometimes, these overachievers, are trying to give the right answer, I guess. They'll say, I'm ready to play in the NHL in the fall. And Ross Mahoney's like, whoa, pump the brakes. Maybe you want to rethink what I just asked you there. That's what I think is most impressive, because to be clear here, young people in general and younger hockey players, I think, get a lot of grief for maybe not being as tough as in the old days, when the guys were a bit more rough and tough and these new guys are maybe a little soft. I don't think that's the case for A. And B, these guys are far more mature and far more self-aware than they were years ago. That's what I saw that was very apparent in Lynden Lakovic. He knew what he needed to work on. He knew that his 200-foot game needed work, that he needed to use his size to his advantage, that the maturity in these young guys, even at 18 years old, is beyond refreshing. It's almost like they train these guys not to just be hockey players, but to give the right answers. And I don't want to diminish what he said, but you know what I'm talking about, that these guys are in a much better place than they were years ago. And again, don't expect him to crack the roster this fall. So if you thought there was a chance that, Lynden Lakovic is going to make the opening night roster, I don't think too many people think that, but maybe you do. I really don't think that's the case, unless something absolutely crazy happens. But you're watching the early stages of a really smart, physical power forward in the making. That's what to marvel at, because, you take a look at it and time flies, and I hate to sound like an old guy here, but if you got kids, you know that it seemed like I was, giving them a bottle the other day and now they're 5-6 years old. Well, it's the same thing with these players. I think back on how long Tom Wilson has been in the league, right? And all of a sudden that he's kind of, one of the, mentor voices and one of the older guys on the team. That what you're witnessing here is the young talent that, let's look back on that. Lynden Lakovic, at this point, where is he going to be 3-4 years from now? And we'll look back on that. Go, remember that young kid when he's 18, and look at him now. Just a total game changer for the Capitals. That is what is ultimately so refreshing and what I like about these development camps. You see young, raw talent, hungry for greater things. And I think that Lynden Lakovic has a truly bright future. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about Cole Hutson's breakout. Cole Hutson, wow, this guy, next level. And Milton Gästrin signs his entry-level contract. straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. In the final segment here, we're talking about a difference maker, Cole Hutson. If you are familiar, and does that Hutson name sound familiar? Well, Lane Hutson, his brother, another really great player, and surprise, surprise, usually when there's brothers and they play hockey and they're in the NHL, usually both of them are pretty darn good. And that holds true in the Hutson house as well, or at one time the Hutson house. So let's dive into that in the final segment of the show here. And we've got some prospect buzz coming out of development camp. And I think a lot of that got lost in all this free agency. Maybe they could move it where we could, not make it at the same time so we can kind of concentrate more on it. I'd be willing to bet that more people were keyed in on what players the Capitals were going to acquire instead of what this young talent was doing. But you should pay attention because Cole Hutson, game changer. And I think that, like I said, he is going to be the next wave. Lane Hutson, Cole Hutson, amazing player. So Cole taken 43rd overall in 2024. And what a freshman year he had at Boston University. If you guys don't get a chance to watch these college games, I know there's a lot of Capitals hockey to watch, but do yourself a favor. BU, Boston College, some of the best in the country, to be sure. And I'm a little bit, slanted. I like the University of Minnesota Duluth as well, but Boston, a hockey hotbed, to be sure. So BU, Boston College, but in Cole Hutson's case, big points, 48 points in 39 games. Tim Taylor Award winner, led the NCAA rookies in scoring. That's not what have you done for me lately? That's something. Oh, yeah. And best defenseman at World Juniors. Yeah, no biggie. And if you saw his skating work and what he was doing at development camp, just truly amazing. Now, Cole admits it wasn't easy at first. Said the older NCAA guys were just more physical, grittier, wore him down. But once he adjusted, he took off like a truly great player will do. And playing with Ryan Leonard at the Worlds, that gave him a ton of confidence. Funny moment, though. He showed up to a playoff game in Montreal wearing a Canadian sweater because Lane bought him the ticket. Spencer Carbery joked about the whole thing, calling it, quote unquote, terrible. But make no mistake, Hutson doesn't think that he's NHL ready yet. Again, see what I'm talking about? Notice the common theme there, that these guys are honest, and that's what he is. He knows he's not ready, but he knows what he needs to do. That's what's also refreshing about these guys. He knows what he needs to do to get there. Said he's going back to BU, plans to work on the defensive side of games, and I think really mature. That's the common theme. He said, quote, "I had so much fun. It'd be stupid not to go back," unquote. That's the quote. Love it. I do love it. And, I never faulted Ryan Leonard either. These are young guys. Don't let some old people skew your opinion, and they don't. But don't listen to these old guys say that you should go pro right now. Live your best life. You're young men. Play at college if you want to. Live your best life, and it appears they're doing it. Now, before we go, we got to mention this as well, is Milton Gästrin, if that name sounds familiar, Swedish player, drafted this most recent draft here, signed his entry-level deal, 877 AAV, 3 years. He's going to stay in Sweden this season in the SHL, which is a good call. Let him keep developing. We saw what it meant for Crystal. Some people, and there's a person on YouTube in particular that says hopefully they don't pick up too many bad habits. I've heard that comment, and I agree with that. But at the end of the day, some of these guys just aren't ready yet. I think that Milton Gästrin, and the comment the other person is making is more specifically about Andrew Crystal. And I hear that you can pick up bad habits, but as far as Milton Gästrin is concerned, I think that working on your game in Sweden is an excellent idea. Two-way game, great hockey IQ, good skater, good in all three zones. And he said himself, his 200-foot game, or his 200-foot player who competes and has vision. So he checks a lot of boxes as a young guy, and another truly great game changer to come out of Sweden. So between Hutson, Gästrin, Lakovic, and Crystal, the pipeline is humming. That's what I'm talking about. I don't want to get too caught up in the doldrums of anxiety and frustration about why we didn't get this player that we don't even know what they would have done, right? On paper. But what do we know? The guy was injury prone, Ehlers, that kind of thing. That let's concentrate on the good. And I do that in life. If there's anything negative, I try to sway my thought to something that's going to get me out of my funk. And in this case, I'm bummed about Ehlers, but the pipeline is packed and the Capitals' future is a bright one. All right. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week, available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holney, and I'll talk to you again next time.